And you and I first started talking around this concept of Tornado Alley and how some people kind of feel like it's moving further to the east. But you might say that Tornado Alley is a misnomer. So can you explain to us your stance on the risk of tornadoes and how it's changing across different regions?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, one of the hopefully the take homes from this podcast is that climate change is not unidirectional. It doesn't affect every location and every phenomena the same way. For tornadoes specifically, these are one of these perils that are below the scale of our climate models. They require us to use what's kind of called model telescoping, where we take that information and feed it into very high resolution models to look to see what the future of tornadoes might hold. And you're exactly right. I don't like Tornado Alley, that term, because I think it gives a misnomer that folks, or maybe a false sense of security, some complacency, if you will, for that tornadoes happen in a very specific area of the country, or don't have to worry about that. That's Dorothy, Wizard of Oz, Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma. When in reality, tornadoes can happen in all 50 states at any time of the year, as long as the ingredients are present. And then when you start to answer the question of, okay, well, that's great, but how does climate change impact these events? All of those research studies are really in their infancy. We use models, but sometimes we only have one or two models. And so we can't get a really nice, robust sample size of how climate change will impact some of these events. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The studies that are out there, and I've authored some of them, do show that the greatest frequency of tornadoes and hailstorms in the future will not be in the same location that it is now. Some places will receive more, some places will receive less. And it goes back to that comment of the non-unidirectional, non-linear nature of climate change, depending on where you live. I mean, to me, climate change is very much a regionally driven response. Yes, there is this overall global warming of the temperatures, but how any individual location is going to manifest and feel those results at the census tract level, for example, will be different.
And it's also this idea that I feel like some people are starting to see, oh, there's more tornadoes, in the South than there used to be or something like that. Well, maybe, or maybe it's just that there's more people being impacted, so you hear about it more versus in quote unquote Tornado Alley, which is vast farmlands and lower populations. There's still damage to be made. I've seen some really impressive photos of just entire grain silos just smashed to pieces. But that damage is a fraction of what might happen if a tornado drops in a southern state. So these populations are different, and we're seeing the same thing around wildfires. There's always been wildfires, but now more and more people are living in that urban wildland landscape, and so there more people are being affected by them.
You are absolutely right. One of the major points I always try to get across when I talk to people is that climate change is only one side of the coin. When you talk about altering the frequency or probability that these events are going to occur is only one side of the coin. If the event occurs where nobody lives, nobody reports on it, right? It's not a big deal. So the exposure and vulnerability and changes to our human landscape and changes to the human built environment are just as important as to how the peril might change in the future. Um, Colorado is a great example of this. The Front Range, and I'll take a very specific example with hail. If you've been to Denver lately or flown into the Denver International Airport, there's no doubt that you've seen all the development and that's been going on in the Interstate 25 corridor. That corridor is actually one of the hail capitals of the world. And so it's building, right, an exposure in these hazard prone areas, whether it's a hurricane or a wildfire, as you mentioned, or a tornado, as we continue to grow our cities and grow our footprint on the surface of the earth, of course, we're going to have more of these damaging $1 billion weather disasters because we're really just putting more assets and more targets in the way. So it's really not just it's easy to kind of blame climate change and say climate change is having this huge role on all these $1 billion disasters and there's nothing we can do about it unless we stop carbon emissions. Okay, I hear you. Climate change is a big problem. We need to address that. And that's a physical science issue. But there's also this societal issue of exposure and building footprints and land use and the way we develop and how we develop and the strength of our development and engineering that also play a massive role in these disasters that are becoming more frequent, partly because of climate change, but also partly because of where we're developing.
And also, we have vastly more interconnected information and communication systems, so we can report and measure and report on all of this stuff much better. So, this is one of the questions I have for you because sometimes people are like, well, are they more frequent or is it just because we're reporting them more? Like, we just know about them more.
There's definitely an increase in reporting, okay, right? So, like, for example, in the mid 1950s, if a tornado happened in Kansas, it probably wasn't going to get reported unless it hit a farmstead. Nowadays, that tornado is up on YouTube within 2 to 3 minutes because there's a storm chaser out there with a cell phone and is able to upload it from the field. Um, but if you look at records that are independent of humans, that do not rely on observations, we still can see these trends. So we know that some of them are still physical, and some, though, there are, of course, things that we can do, bias correction for population and so on, to kind of take that curve away, to normalize, if you will, those observations. But the reality is, yeah, I mean, we're seeing more and more disasters around us because we have people living in disaster prone areas. And, it's easy to report on them. They're people, by the way, I don't know if you've noticed this, but people are fascinated with disasters. I mean, it's just a human kind of component that when you see damage, you're kind of drawn into those changes, and you want to learn more about those. You want to learn why it happened and how it happened and who it affected and those sorts of stories. Um, you don't hear about, generally speaking, if a tornado, let me just give you an example. Let's say a tornado hits a small town and 4 people die. That's probably going to be front page news across majority of the nation. You probably don't hear about 4 people dying from heart disease yesterday, right? So it's just kind of like how you die, right? In the way, like, those 4 people weren't supposed to die because of that tornado. Whereas heart disease is kind of one of those things you just kind of throw your hands up in the air. So, um, yeah, these are challenging events, and they are happening with greater frequency, despite the fact that, yes, indeed, we are reporting on them more.